Case 1. Robin Lee Rowe. February 10th, 1992. 2:47 a.m. A neighbor in Boise smells smoke. Not the clean scent of a fireplace or a backyard bonfire. This is thick, acrid chemical. The kind that coats the back of your throat and makes your eyes water even from a distance. The neighbor stumbles out onto his porch, squinting through the frozen Idaho night, and sees it. Orange flames licking out from the duplex across the street. Dark smoke billowing into the starless sky. He can hear the crackle and pop of wood splitting, glass shattering. He runs back inside and dials 911, his voice frantic. There are people in there. There are kids in there. Boise Fire Department arrives within minutes. Firefighters pour out of the trucks, axes in hand, hoses uncoiling. The heat is intense even from the curb. They force their way through the front door, no signs of forced entry, locked from the inside, and push into the smoke. Visibility is almost zero. They follow training, sweeping rooms calling out. The air is poison. They find them in the bedrooms. Randy Rowe, the father, in one room. 10-year-old Joshua in another. 8-year-old Tabitha in hers. All three still in their beds. All three beyond help. The smoke had gotten to them first. Thick, suffocating, deadly. The autopsies would later confirm it. Soot in their lungs. They had been alive when the fire started, breathing in the toxic air as the flames crept closer, unable to escape, unable to scream loud enough to be heard over the roar. Outside, behind the police tape, stands a woman in a nightgown. No coat, no shoes. It's February in Idaho. Temperatures hovering just above freezing. Her name is Robin Lee Rowe. She is Randy's wife, Joshua and Tabitha's mother. Officers approach her, expecting hysteria, expecting collapse. Instead, they find something else. No tears, no panic, just watching. One officer would later testify that she seemed more curious than grief-stricken, like she was observing something distant and impersonal. Another noted that she offered shifting, inconsistent explanations about where she had been that night, why she wasn't inside, who might have done this. But her eyes kept drifting back to the flames, calm and unblinking. This wasn't the first time fire followed Robin Rowe, and it wouldn't be the last time a mother in Idaho would stand accused of the unthinkable. Over the next hour, you're going to meet 8 women, mothers, stepmothers, caregivers, all convicted of murdering the children in their care, right here in Idaho. Some used fire, some used fists, one used a burn barrel, another a belief system so twisted it justified burying her own kids in a backyard pet cemetery. These aren't nameless monsters, they're real. Their victims had names, favorite toys, dreams. And in almost every case, someone saw the warning signs and didn't act in time. You'll hear their names. You'll see how investigators caught them. And you'll understand why Idaho still grapples with these cases today. Before we go any further, if you're interested in true crime that digs deeper than headlines, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We post new deep dive documentaries every week. All right, let's get into it. Quick question before we dive in. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. The firefighters who entered that duplex on Seneca Street would later describe it as a scene engineered for maximum destruction. There was no forced entry. The front door had been locked from the inside. The windows were intact. Whoever set this fire had access, had been inside, and had taken steps to make sure no one got out in time. The smoke detectors, which should have been screaming long before the neighbors smelled anything, were silent. Investigators would soon discover why. They hadn't malfunctioned. Someone had deliberately switched off the circuit breaker, cutting power to the alarms. The 3 bodies told their own story. Randy Rowe, 35, a steady worker at Boise Cascade who loved fishing and spending time with his kids. Joshua, 10, a boy who liked building things and riding his bike around the neighborhood. Tabitha 8, her brother's shadow, always laughing. The autopsies confirmed what the scene suggested. All three had soot deep in their lungs. They had been alive as the fire burned around them, breathing in smoke, suffocating slowly in their own beds while flames crept through the home. Robin's behavior that night raised immediate red flags. Her stories kept shifting. First, she said she had been out for a walk. Then she suggested she had stepped outside briefly and couldn't get back in. She floated vague theories about enemies, about people who might have wanted to hurt Randy. But nothing she said added up, and nothing explained why she showed no visible grief, no tears, no shock, no collapse. Just a blank, detached calm that unnerved every officer who spoke to her. What investigators found when they started digging into Robin's finances painted a clear picture: desperation. By early 1992, she was drowning, gambling debts, bad checks bouncing all over Boise, unpaid bills stacking up. She had been lying to Randy about the extent of it, hiding the worst from him while the hole got deeper. To anyone watching from the outside, the Rose looked like a typical working-class family scraping by. Inside, Robin was in freefall. And then came the policies. Between the fall of 1991 and early 1992, just weeks before the fire, Robin had quietly taken out 6 separate life insurance policies on Randy, Joshua, and Tabitha. The total coverage was around $276,000, a staggering sum for a family living paycheck to paycheck. Robin was named as the sole beneficiary on every single one. Insurance agents who had worked with her later recalled feeling uneasy about some of her questions. She asked repeatedly whether the children were fully covered, whether there were any gaps, whether the payouts would come quickly. One agent remembered her fixating on the kids' coverage in a way that felt off. But at the time, he didn't know what to do with that instinct. Keep that question in your mind. We'll come back to it. The fire marshal's report came back damning. This was arson, no question. Investigators found multiple points of origin inside the duplex, fires that had been set intentionally in different rooms to ensure the blaze spread quickly and couldn't be easily contained. There were clear pour patterns on the floors, the telltale trails left behind when an accelerant is spread across a surface. Lab analysis confirmed gasoline residue in several key areas. And then there was the disabled smoke detector, the circuit breaker deliberately thrown to the off position. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragic kitchen fire or a space heater malfunction. This was premeditated, calculated murder. But it wasn't the first time Robin had been at the center of a deadly fire. In 1980, while living in California, Robin's young son Keith had died in a cabin fire. She collected about $28,000 in life insurance afterward. At the time, the fire was ruled accidental and no charges were filed. But once the Boise case broke, investigators went back and took a harder look. The similarities were striking. Another fire, another dead child, another insurance payout, and Robin walking away unscathed. Go back even further to New Hampshire, and there was another death. An infant daughter who had died under circumstances labeled as SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Again, no charges. Again, no follow-up. But now, looking at the pattern, a horrifying picture emerged. 2 fires, 2 dead children, and now 3 more. In March 1993, a jury in Ada County convicted Robin Lee Rowe on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of aggravated arson. The evidence was overwhelming. The policies, the financial motive, the forensic findings, the prior fire, and her complete lack of believable explanation or remorse. In December 1993, District Judge Alan Schwartzman sentenced her to death. In his remarks from the bench, he called her crimes the final betrayal of maternal instinct, a descent into darkness that defied comprehension. He emphasized the cold premeditation, The careful groundwork with the insurance policies, the disabling of the smoke alarms, the pouring of accelerant, the decision to lock the door and walk away while her husband and children died. Robin Lee Rowe remains the only woman on Idaho's death row today. She is held at the Pocatello Women's Facility, where she has spent more than 3 decades filing post-conviction appeals and federal habeas petitions. Every single one has been denied. She remains under a death sentence, her name synonymous with one of Boise's most notorious family murders. For the community, the case left a scar, a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger to a child comes from the one person who is supposed to protect them above all others. Robin Rowe set a grim precedent, but she was far from the last Idaho mother to make national headlines for unthinkable crimes. And the next case, well, it became one of the most infamous in modern American true crime. Case 2. Lori Vallow Daybell Joshua Jackson J.J. Vallow was 7 years old. He was autistic, nonverbal at times, but he had a smile that could light up a room. He loved music, especially anything with a strong beat, and he had this habit of calling people buddy. Teachers, neighbors, strangers at the grocery store, everyone was buddy. He needed routine, structure, and patience, and when he got those things, he thrived. He loved being outside, playing with toys, and most of all, being around his big sister. Tylee Ashlyn Ryan was 16, sharp as a tack, quick with a comeback, fiercely protective of JJ. She wasn't just his sister, she was like a second mom to him. She knew his routines, his triggers, how to calm him down when the world got too loud. She was funny, sarcastic in that teenage way, but deeply loyal. She had dreams, college maybe, a life beyond the chaos her mother kept dragging them into. She loved taking photos, being with friends, and making sure JJ was okay. By June 2020, both of them would be found buried in shallow graves in rural Idaho, and their mother would be partying in Hawaii. Lori Vallow didn't start out as a doomsday cult figure. For years, she was just another mom in the LDS community. Married multiple times, raising kids, moving around. But somewhere along the way, she drifted into the fringes of extreme, apocalyptic ideology. It wasn't mainstream Mormonism. It was something darker, more obsessive, built on end-times prophecies and a belief that certain people were chosen to survive an imminent apocalypse, while others were obstacles to be removed. Enter Chad Daybell. A self-styled prophet and author of low-budget doomsday fiction, Chad had a small but devoted following. He claimed to have visions, to communicate with the other side, to know who was light and who was dark. He and Lori met at a religious conference, and they clicked immediately. 2 people who saw themselves as special, chosen, destined for something greater. Together, they built a shared fantasy world where normal moral boundaries didn't apply. At the center of their belief system was the concept of zombies, not the Hollywood kind, but people whose bodies had supposedly been taken over by dark spirits. According to Chad and Lori, these people were no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. Their deaths weren't murder, they were spiritual liberation, a necessary step in preparing for the end times. Friends who spent time around Lori during this period later testified that she had begun rating people on a scale of light to dark. And at some point she told multiple people that both JJ and Tylee had become dark, that they were zombies, that they were no longer her children in any real sense. If that sounds insane to you, it should. But to Lori and Chad, it was permission. September 8, 2019. Tylee is last seen on a family trip to Yellowstone National Park. There's a photo of her at the entrance, smiling, arm around her uncle Alex Cox. It's the last known image of her alive. September 21, 2019. JJ is last seen by neighbors in Rexburg, Idaho, playing outside in the late afternoon. Later that evening, Lori's brother Alex is seen carrying JJ inside, putting him to bed. The next morning, JJ is gone. Not missing in the sense that anyone reported him missing right away. Just gone. Erased from normal life. When school staff called to ask why JJ hadn't shown up, Lori said she'd be homeschooling him. When relatives asked where the kids were, Lori's answers kept shifting. JJ was staying with friends. JJ was with a relative in Arizona. Tylee was away at college, even though she was only 16 and had never enrolled anywhere. Or Tylee was just not here anymore, a phrase Lori used more than once, with a chilling casualness. JJ's grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, grew frantic. They tried calling, texting, showing up. Lori blocked them. They knew something was terribly wrong. October 19, 2019. Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy, dies suddenly at their home in Fremont County, Idaho. She was only 49, relatively healthy. The initial report labeled her death as natural causes, and she was buried quickly without an autopsy. November 5, 2019, just over 2 weeks after Tammy's death, Lori and Chad get married on a beach in Kauai, Hawaii. They post photos, smiling, tanned, carefree. Lori in a white dress, Chad in a Hawaiian shirt, both of them looking like newlyweds on a dream vacation. While they sipped cocktails and posed for selfies, 2 children were already dead and buried in Chad's backyard. In late November 2019, Rexburg police, acting on a plea from the Woodcocks, attempted a welfare check on JJ. Lori told them JJ was safe, that he was in Arizona with a friend. Officers asked to see him. She refused. The next day, they returned with a search warrant. Lori and Chad were gone. They had fled Idaho overnight, eventually surfacing in Hawaii, where they continued to live it up while refusing to answer a single question about the children's whereabouts. The case exploded. National media picked it up. The question echoed everywhere, on every news channel, every true crime forum, every missing persons page. Where are the children? June 9th, 2020. Investigators working with the FBI had been tracing cell phone data from Lori's brother Alex Cox, who had died suddenly in December 2019 from what was ruled natural causes. His phone had pinged repeatedly at specific spots on Chad Daybell's rural property in Salem, Idaho, on the mornings right after each child was last seen. Search teams, cadaver dogs, and forensic experts converged on the property. It didn't take long. Near a pet cemetery area on the property, they found JJ. He was in a shallow grave wrapped tightly in black plastic with duct tape wound around his head, arms, and legs. His little body had been positioned carefully, deliberately. He was still wearing his red pajamas. A short distance away in a fire pit area, they found what was left of Tylee. Her remains had been dismembered and burned, scattered among the dirt and ash. The condition of her body was so disturbing that seasoned investigators stepped back, some visibly shaken. One officer was seen standing apart from the scene, head bowed, silently praying. These weren't hurried burials. They were deliberate concealments. In May 2023, a jury in Fremont County convicted Lori Vallow Daybell of first-degree murder in the deaths of JJ and Tylee, and conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Tammy Daybell. She was also convicted of grand theft for continuing to collect Social Security benefits for the children long after they were dead. She was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. She has since also been convicted in Arizona for conspiring to murder her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, who was shot and killed by her brother Alex in July 2019. Chad Daybell was tried separately in 2024. A jury found him guilty on all counts, including the murders of Tammy, JJ, and Tylee. After a penalty phase, the jury recommended the death penalty, and the court imposed it. Prosecutors emphasized the especially cruel nature of the crimes and the twisted religious manipulation that accompanied them. If you're still with me, thank you. I know these stories are heavy, but it's important we remember these kids, not just the headlines. If this kind of deep dive true crime is your thing, go ahead and smash that like button and share this video with someone who's into real, researched crime stories. It really helps the channel grow. Lori Vallow's case was a media firestorm, but some of Idaho's most brutal maternal crimes happened in total silence, behind closed doors with no reporters, no search parties. Just a child, alone and suffering. Case 3, Emrik Osuna. 9-year-old Emrik Osuna lived with his father, Eric, and stepmother, Monique, in a Meridian apartment. To anyone on the outside, they looked like a strict but functional family. Eric worked. Monique stayed home. Emrik went to school, at least at first. But over time, the walls around that apartment grew higher and thicker. Emrik was pulled out of public school and labeled as homeschooled, a decision that cut him off from teachers, counselors, and other mandatory reporters who might have noticed the changes in him. Neighbors heard noise, thuds against walls, raised voices, the sound of someone running or jumping for long stretches, but most dismissed it as the chaos of a busy household. Kids are loud, parents yell, it's normal, right? Behind those walls, what was happening to Emrik was anything but normal. It was a grinding, relentless regime of torture. After Emrik's death, police executed a search warrant and recovered hundreds of video clips from the Osuna's own devices, phones, tablets, computers. What those videos showed was so disturbing that experienced detectives, people who had worked homicides and child abuse cases for years, could not watch more than a few minutes at a time. Some stepped out into hallways and broke down. Others had to take days off after viewing the footage. The videos documented a system of abuse that had clearly been escalating for months, maybe longer. Emrik was forced to perform punishing physical exercises, jumping jacks, wall sits, running in place, for hours on end, until his small body simply gave out and he collapsed. When he fell, he was ordered to get up and keep going. If he couldn't, he was punished further. He was confined in a closet or a cold garage-like space for extended periods, often wearing little clothing, shivering, alone in the dark. He was struck repeatedly with belts, wooden objects, and other household items. The blows left bruises that layered on top of older bruises, creating a patchwork of pain across his back, arms, and legs. And he was starved. Emrik was denied food for days at a time as punishment for perceived failures or disobedience. By the time he died, his weight was drastically, shockingly below what it should have been for a 9-year-old boy. He looked like a child from a famine zone, not a kid living in a middle-class apartment in Meridian, Idaho. Why did they record it? Control. Documentation of what they saw as discipline. Or maybe they just didn't think they'd ever get caught. By the night of September 1st, 2020, Emrik could no longer stand on his own. His body had been pushed past every limit. He had no reserves left, no fat, no muscle, no strength. He was shutting down. The next morning, a 911 call came in from the apartment. The caller reported that a 9-year-old boy had fallen in the shower and was unresponsive. Paramedics and police arrived within minutes. The moment first responders saw Emrik, they knew this was not a fresh injury from a fall. This was something much worse. Emrik was cold to the touch, a sign that his body temperature had dropped dangerously low, likely over an extended period. He was severely underweight, his ribs and bones visible under his skin. He was covered in bruises in different stages of healing, some fresh, some days old, some weeks old. His body told the story of prolonged, systematic abuse. He was rushed to St. Luke's Children's Hospital, but there was nothing doctors could do. Emrik was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The autopsy painted a horrifying picture. Emrik had died from what the medical examiner classified as homicide by abuse, a combination of severe malnutrition, dehydration, repeated physical trauma, and hypothermia. His body had been subjected to conditions that no child should ever endure. He had injuries in various stages of healing, indicating that the abuse had been ongoing for a significant period of time. His core body temperature at the time of death was dangerously low. Consistent with prolonged exposure to cold environments, he had essentially been tortured to death. Both Eric and Monique were charged with first-degree murder and multiple counts of injury to a child. Prosecutors made it clear that this was not a case of one abusive parent and one passive bystander. Both were responsible. Monique was the primary enforcer, the one issuing orders, designing punishments, and delivering much of the hands-on violence. But Eric was there. He watched. He filmed. He enabled. He did nothing to stop it, nothing to protect his son, nothing to seek help. In 2022, Monique Osuna was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, Judge Stephen Hippler did not mince words. He called her conduct sadistic and evil, noting her complete lack of emotion or remorse even when confronted with the videos of what she had done. Later that same year, Eric Osuna accepted a plea deal and was also sentenced to life in prison, effectively with no realistic hope of release. In the days and weeks after Emrik's death, vigils were held across Meridian and the Treasure Valley. People who had never met Emrik came together to mourn him, to say his name, to make sure he was remembered. They brought dinosaur toys, one of Emrik's favorite things, and left them at makeshift memorials. Teachers and parents wrestled publicly with the question that haunts every case like this. How could such severe, prolonged abuse go undetected for so long? Real quick, what time is it where you are right now? I'm curious how many of you are watching this late at night versus during the day. Drop the time in the comments. Monique and Eric hid their abuse behind closed doors. But some killers don't bother hiding the aftermath. They just burn the evidence. Case 4. Veronica Lynn, Herrera. 2-year-old Nakita Herrera, her family called her Kata Bean, lived with her mother Veronica in a small, weathered trailer outside Homedale in rural Owyhee County. It was the kind of place where neighbors were spread out, where privacy was easy to come by, and where people mostly kept to themselves. Nakita was a bright, bubbly toddler who loved Minnie Mouse, chasing bubbles in the yard and being outside in the sun. She had that toddler energy. Always moving, always curious, always getting into things. The property around the trailer was cluttered with outbuildings, scrap metal, old furniture, and a burn barrel out back that Veronica used for trash. It was a common sight in rural Idaho, a rusted metal drum where people burned garbage to avoid the cost and hassle of regular trash pickup. In August 2012, something violent happened inside that trailer. Veronica would later tell investigators that Nakita had fallen and hit her head. A tragic accident, a moment of inattention. But forensic evidence told a very different story. When crime scene analysts processed the trailer, they found blood spatter on the walls and on the ceiling. Blood doesn't end up on a ceiling from a toddler falling and bumping her head. The spatter patterns were consistent with high-impact force, the kind that comes from a beating or from a small body being swung or thrown against a hard surface. The height and distribution of the blood made it clear this was not an accident. This was homicidal violence, and instead of calling 911, instead of seeking help or reporting what had happened, Veronica made a choice. She decided to destroy the body. Over the next couple of days, Veronica set about erasing her daughter. She purchased or gathered accelerants, likely lighter fluid or gasoline, and prepared the burn barrel. At some point, she placed Nakita's small body inside the barrel, layered it with trash and debris, and set it on fire. The fire burned hot and long, fueled by the accelerants and fed by additional garbage over multiple sessions. At times, Veronica involved her older children in the process, instructing them to add trash to the fire to keep it going. They had no idea what was inside. Imagine being one of those older kids tossing trash into a fire not knowing your baby sister was in there. Law enforcement arrived at the property after relatives began raising concerns. Nakita hadn't been seen in days. Veronica's explanations were vague and inconsistent. When deputies walked the property, they noticed the burn barrel out back. It was still warm. There was a smell, distinct, heavy, disturbing. Not the smell of burning plastic or wood. Something else. They looked inside. Amid the ash and charred debris, they found bone fragments. Small, delicate pieces. Tissue that had been partially consumed by fire but not completely destroyed. It didn't take long for investigators to realize what they were looking at. Forensic anthropologists were called in to carefully sift through the contents of the barrel. Over the course of hours, they painstakingly recovered what they estimated to be about 85% of Nakita's small body. Enough to confirm her identity. Enough to tell the story of what had been done to her. Forensic analysis confirmed that Nakita had died from homicidal head trauma, not from any accidental fall. The injuries to her skull were consistent with blunt force impact, the kind inflicted by an adult in a moment of rage or frustration. And then her mother had tried to erase her, to burn away the evidence, to make it look like Nakita had simply vanished. Veronica Lynn Herrera was charged with multiple counts, including murder, failure to report a death, destruction and concealment of evidence, and injury to a child. Facing the possibility of a much longer sentence if convicted at trial, she eventually entered a plea agreement in 2013. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, failure to report a death, destruction and concealment of evidence, and multiple counts of injury to a child, charges that reflected not only Nakita's death but also the psychological and emotional harm inflicted on her older children, who had unknowingly participated in the destruction of their sister's body. She was sentenced to a unified 30 years in prison, 15 years fixed, 15 years indeterminate. That means she must serve at least 15 years before she is even eligible to appear before the parole board. Her earliest possible parole window opens in the late 2020s. As of 2025, she remains in the custody of the Idaho Department of Correction. For the investigators and first responders who worked the case, the image of that warm burn barrel and what they found inside remains one of the most haunting scenes of their careers. For the people of Owyhee County, a rural community where everyone knows everyone, the case was a wound that never fully healed. Nakita Keta Bean. Herrera was 2 years old. She loved Minnie Mouse and Bubbles, and her mother burned her body in a barrel in the backyard. Veronica tried to erase all trace of Nakita, but some killers take a different approach. They hide in plain sight, staging elaborate public searches while knowing exactly where the child is. Case 5. Melissa Jenkins and Daniel Lyryk Jr. 8-year-old Robbie Manwill was the kind of kid teachers loved having in class. Soft-spoken, polite, kind to other kids. He loved Spider-Man, had action figures lined up on his dresser, and spent hours riding his bike around the neighborhood when the weather was good. Robbie split his time between 2 households, his father and stepmother's home, where he was safe, loved, and thriving, and his mother Melissa Jenkins' apartment in Boise, where she lived with her boyfriend Daniel Lyryk Jr. Lyryk was much older than Melissa, with a reputation for anger and control issues. Friends and family had noticed the tension in that apartment, the way Lyryk's mood could shift without warning, the way Melissa seemed to shrink around him. But no one imagined what was coming. On the night of July 24, 2009, Melissa and Lyryk told police that Robbie had vanished. They said he had left the apartment to visit a friend somewhere in the complex and never came back. They described him as wearing a specific outfit, a red shirt, shorts, sneakers. They said they had looked everywhere, asked neighbors, searched the grounds. They were frantic, they said, desperate to find him. The reality was very different. Robbie had been brutally beaten inside that apartment. The injuries documented later by the medical examiner were severe and unmistakable. Broken ribs, a torn liver, significant head trauma. These were not injuries that could be explained away by a fall off a bike or a tumble down the stairs. This was the result of sustained violent force applied by an adult. Robbie had been hit, kicked, or thrown with enough power to cause catastrophic internal damage, and instead of calling 911, instead of trying to save him or get him help, Melissa and Lyryk made a choice. They loaded Robbie's small body into a vehicle and drove about a dozen miles west to the New York Canal near Kuna, a rural irrigation canal that runs through farmland and scrub. They left him in the water, weighed down or positioned in a way that they hoped would keep him hidden. Then they drove home, cleaned up, and reported him missing. Boise responded with one of the most extensive child searches in the city's history. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers had mobilized, neighbors, church groups, strangers who had seen Robbie's face on the news. They all showed up. They walked fields, combed through alleys, searched along riverbanks and canals. Blue ribbons began appearing all over the city, tied to trees, mailboxes, fences, symbols of hope, prayers that Robbie would be found safe. Melissa appeared on local TV, tears streaming down her face, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She begged for her son's safe return. She described him as a sweet, innocent boy who just wanted to come home. The community rallied around her. People brought food, offered support, organized search parties. For about 10 days, the city of Boise believed that Robbie Manwill might still be alive, that he might be found wandering, scared but okay. Every person searching fields and riverbanks, Melissa knew. She knew he was already dead. On August 3, 2009, canal workers were draining part of the New York Canal for routine maintenance. As the water level dropped, one of the workers saw something that made him stop. A small body floating near the edge. The clothing matched exactly what Melissa had said Robbie was wearing the day he disappeared. The red shirt, the shorts, the sneakers. The autopsy confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. Robbie had died from blunt force trauma before he ever entered the canal. He had not drowned. He had been dead or dying when he was placed in the water. There were signs of prior abuse, older bruises, healed fractures indicating that this was not the first time Robbie had been hurt. There was also duct tape residue on his skin, suggesting he had been restrained at some point, either before or after death. Detectives went back to the apartment and began building the case piece by piece. Cell phone records placed both Melissa and Lyryk near the canal on the night Robbie disappeared. Cadaver dogs were brought into the apartment and Melissa's vehicle. They alerted in both locations, indicating the presence of human remains. Neighbors were re-interviewed. Several reported hearing loud arguments and heavy thuds coming from the apartment the night before Robbie was reported missing. One neighbor said it sounded like furniture being thrown or someone being slammed against a wall. Under sustained questioning, both Melissa and Lyryk's stories began to change. Details shifted. Timelines didn't match. The cracks widened. Daniel Lyryk Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder. He received 2 consecutive life sentences, effectively ensuring he will never be released. The jury and judge concluded that he was the one who had inflicted the fatal injuries, that he had beaten Robbie to death in a fit of rage. Melissa Jenkins was convicted of aiding and abetting first-degree murder. She received a life sentence with a fixed minimum of approximately 25 years before she would be eligible for parole. The court found that while she may not have delivered the blows that killed Robbie, she had participated in the cover-up, helped dispose of his body, and then stood in front of cameras and lied to the entire community, exploiting their goodwill and compassion while knowing her son was already dead. At sentencing, the judge did not hold back. He emphasized that Melissa and Lyryk had not only killed a child, they had weaponized the community's willingness to help. They had let hundreds of people search in vain, let them hope, let them pray, all while knowing exactly where Robbie was. In the years since, Robbie's memory has been honored through Robbie's Run, an annual 5K held in Boise. Participants wear blue ribbons. Families bring their kids. It's a way to remember a boy who loved Spider-Man and riding his bike, a boy who deserved so much better. Blue ribbons still appear around the city on the anniversary of his death, quiet reminders that Boise has not forgotten. Look, I get it. These stories are hard to hear. But I think it's important we don't look away. These kids deserve to be remembered. If you agree, do me a favor. Hit the like button if you haven't already and drop a comment with just one word. Robbie's name or Emrik's or JJ's. Let's make sure they're not forgotten. Not all maternal killings are about prolonged abuse or staged disappearances. Some happen in a moment of panic, and what follows is a desperate attempt to hide what was done. Case 6. Elizabeth Ann Baker Keyes. In April 2020, 22-year-old Elizabeth Ann Baker Keyes was staying with relatives in Rathdrum, a small town in North Idaho not far from Coeur d'Alene. Elizabeth had a documented history of intellectual disability and a limited understanding of reproduction, medical care, and the consequences of her actions. She was already parenting 2 small children, navigating motherhood with the support of family members who helped her manage day-to-day responsibilities. But there was something Elizabeth had been hiding from almost everyone around her. She was pregnant, whether out of fear, denial, or confusion. She had concealed the pregnancy for months, wearing loose clothing, avoiding questions, and refusing to acknowledge what was happening to her body. On or around April 14, 2020, Elizabeth went into labor. She was alone in the home's bathroom when it happened. There was no one else in the room, no one to call for help, no one to guide her through what was happening. The baby was born full term, a healthy boy by all medical measurements. He was not stillborn. He was not premature. He took multiple breaths after birth, his lungs filling with air, his heart beating. For a brief moment, he was alive. What happened next is reconstructed from forensic evidence, Elizabeth's partial admissions to investigators, and the physical condition of the infant's body when it was eventually discovered. The infant was strangled. According to investigators, Elizabeth used a belt from a bathrobe or a similar ligature, wrapping it around the baby's neck and pulling until he stopped breathing. But that wasn't the end. The baby also suffered multiple cuts, around a dozen stab and slash wounds across his small torso, inflicted with a utility knife or box cutter. The injuries were deliberate, not accidental. They were the actions of someone trying to ensure the baby was dead, or perhaps acting out of panic, confusion, or a dissociative state that Elizabeth herself later claimed not to fully remember. After the baby died, Elizabeth wrapped his body in a towel, placed it inside a plastic bag, and hid it in a closet. Then she cleaned the bathroom, wiping down surfaces, disposing of any visible evidence of the birth, and resumed normal interaction with the rest of the household. She did not tell anyone what had happened. She did not seek medical care for herself, despite having just given birth alone. For about 3 days, the baby's body remained hidden in that closet while life in the house went on around it. The discovery came when a household member, believed to be Elizabeth's mother or another close relative, went into the closet to clean or organize. She found the bag, she opened it, and she screamed. The family immediately transported Elizabeth and the remains to a local hospital. Medical staff took one look at the situation and contacted law enforcement. The baby's body was turned over to the Kootenai County coroner for autopsy. The findings were clear. The baby had been born alive. There was evidence of breathing, air in the lungs, signs of life. The cause of death was homicide, strangulation, with additional cutting injuries. There was no stillbirth. There was no natural cause. This was an intentional killing. Investigators obtained a warrant for Elizabeth's phone and computer. Search history showed that in the weeks and days leading up to the birth, she had been looking up topics related to concealing a pregnancy, self-managed outcomes, and what happens if a baby is born at home without medical help. It suggested that this was not purely a moment of panic. There had been some level of planning or at least contemplation of what she might do. Elizabeth Ann Baker Keyes was charged with second-degree murder and concealment of evidence. Originally, prosecutors considered a first-degree murder charge, but as part of a plea agreement, the charge was reduced. In court, Elizabeth entered an Alford plea, a legal mechanism that allows a defendant to maintain they do not remember intending to commit the crime, but acknowledge that the state has enough evidence to convict them. Elizabeth told the court she did not remember intending to kill the baby, but she did not dispute the facts. In April 2021, Judge John Mitchell sentenced her to 25 years total for second-degree murder. 10 years fixed, 15 years indeterminate, plus a concurrent 5-year sentence for concealment of evidence. She received credit for about a year already served in jail. Under Idaho law, she will not be eligible for parole until she has served the full fixed portion of her sentence, meaning she must serve at least 10 years before she can even appear before the parole board. At sentencing, psychiatrists testified about Elizabeth's intellectual limitations, her history of denial and dissociation, and her difficulty understanding the gravity of what she had done. But the court concluded that despite those factors, a decades-long prison term was necessary. A newborn baby had been killed and hidden, and the law required accountability. Elizabeth's case is a window into neonaticide, killings that happen in the first 24 hours of life, often driven by denial and panic. But the next case is something different, a moment of lethal frustration that took away a future in seconds. Case 7. Danielle Elizabeth Radue. In May 2020, Danielle Elizabeth Radue was living in Meridian, Idaho with her infant son, Dawson McKinney. Dawson was about 2 months old, still tiny, still fragile, still in that exhausting newborn phase of frequent feedings, disrupted sleep, and constant need. His father was serving in the U.S. Air Force, stationed out of state, unable to be home during those early months. He did what thousands of deployed service members do. He stayed connected through video chats, photos, and text messages. He saw his son's face on a screen, heard updates from Danielle, and believed with everything in him that Dawson was safe with his mother. He trusted her. He had no choice but to trust her. Dawson was at one of the most vulnerable stages of human life. 2-month-old infants cannot protect themselves, cannot cry out in a way that brings help, cannot escape. They are entirely dependent on the adults caring for them. And for caregivers, especially those dealing with isolation, stress, or lack of support, that stage can be overwhelming. It does not excuse what happened, but it's part of the context. On May 11th, 2020, Meridian police and paramedics received a 911 call from Danielle's home. She reported that Dawson had gone limp and was unresponsive. First responders arrived within minutes and found the infant in critical condition. He was not breathing on his own. His body was slack, his color poor. They began life-saving measures immediately and rushed him to St. Luke's Children's Hospital in Boise. Doctors in the pediatric intensive care unit quickly recognized what they were seeing. This was not a case of a baby choking on milk or having a sudden medical episode. This was trauma. Dawson had subdural hemorrhages, bleeding between the brain and the skull. He had retinal hemorrhages, bleeding in the back of both eyes, a hallmark sign of violent shaking. His brain was swelling so severely that it was beginning to shift downward inside his skull. A life-threatening condition called herniation. The patterns of injury were not consistent with accidental falls from a couch or bed, not consistent with a caregiver accidentally dropping a baby. They were consistent with violent shaking or impact, force applied by an adult in a moment of rage or frustration. Dawson was placed on life support. His tiny body was hooked up to machines that breathed for him, monitored his failing brain, kept his heart beating. He survived for a few days, long enough for his father to get emergency leave, fly back to Idaho and sit at his bedside in the PICU. Long enough for his father to hold his hand, to whisper to him, to say goodbye. Dawson McKinney died on May 15, 2020. He was 2 months old. Detectives interviewed Danielle multiple times. Her explanations kept changing. At first, she said Dawson had rolled off something and hit his head. Then she said she might have accidentally dropped him. At other points, she minimized the idea that any trauma had occurred at all, suggesting he had just suddenly stopped breathing. But medical experts were categorical and unanimous. Dawson's injuries were non-accidental. They were the result of severe force applied by a caregiver. There was no plausible accident story that could explain the combination of subdural hemorrhages, retinal hemorrhages, and brain swelling. This was inflicted trauma. Danielle was initially charged with felony injury to a child. After Dawson died, the charge was upgraded to first-degree murder. The case moved slowly through the court system, as these cases often do, with experts retained, evidence reviewed, and both sides preparing for what could have been a lengthy trial. In April 2022, Danielle entered an offered plea to first-degree murder. Like Elizabeth Keyes in the previous case, she used a legal mechanism that allowed her to avoid admitting guilt while acknowledging that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict her. She did not say, "I killed my son," but she did say, "I understand a jury would find me guilty." In July 2022, Judge Patrick Miller sentenced Danielle Elizabeth Radue to life in prison, with 18 years fixed before she would be eligible for parole. It was a sentence that reflected the severity of what she had done and the complete innocence of the victim. At the sentencing hearing, Dawson's father stood before the court in his Air Force uniform. He held a photograph of his son, a tiny baby with dark eyes and a soft tuft of hair. He spoke about the milestones that would never happen. Dawson would never take his first steps. He would never say his first word. He would never go to school, play sports, make friends, fall in love, have a life. All of that had been erased in a moment of violence. A man who served his country, trusting his son was safe at home. And he came back to a tiny casket. Before we move on, what's the weather like where you are right now? Sunny? Raining? Snowing? I know it's random, but I'm genuinely curious. Drop it in the comments. Danielle's crime happened in a moment. But the next case, Lyryk's story, was a slow descent into hell, with 2 adults watching, participating, and doing nothing to stop it. Case 8. Amanda Jean Dunlap and Joshua Eric Molina. 20-month-old Lyryk Jean Altom had barely begun to experience the world. She was at that stage where toddlers are learning new words every day, figuring out how to run instead of walk, discovering their own personalities. For much of her short life, Lyryk had lived with her biological parents in what those who knew the family described as a stable, loving environment. But after her parents' relationship ended, Amanda Dunlap, Lyryk's mother, moved with Lyryk and another child into the home of her new boyfriend, Joshua Eric Molina, in the Magic Valley region of south-central Idaho. From that point forward, everything changed. Friends and family members who saw photos of Lyryk began noticing bruises. When they asked Amanda about them, she became defensive, dismissive, or evasive. The visits became less frequent. The communication dropped off. Lyryk was being isolated, and the people who loved her were being shut out. From at least late August 2017, Lyryk endured what investigators would later describe as progressively severe and systematic abuse. She suffered fractures and bruises that Amanda either ignored entirely or lied about, attributing them to falls off furniture, rough play with other children, or normal toddler clumsiness. But the injuries were not normal. They were not accidental, and they kept getting worse. Text messages recovered from Amanda's phone painted a horrifying picture. In one message sent to a friend, Amanda wrote, "Josh broke my kid today. Not Lyryk fell. Not there was an accident. Josh broke my kid." It was a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling casualness that suggested this was not the first time, and that Amanda had accepted it as part of her reality. Other messages showed that Amanda was aware Lyryk needed medical care but was delaying or avoiding it because Melina was afraid of being exposed. He didn't want doctors asking questions. He didn't want authorities getting involved. And Amanda went along with it. By early October 2017, Lyryk had already suffered a series of non-accidental injuries. Grabbing injuries, blunt force trauma, forceful contact that left marks and breaks in various stages of healing. She was in pain. She was scared, and the two adults responsible for her care did nothing to protect her. On the night of October 7, 2017, Lyryk suffered a seizure. Her small body convulsed. Her eyes rolled back. She was in medical crisis, and every second mattered. But instead of calling 911, instead of rushing her to the nearest emergency room, Joshua Melina made a different choice. According to testimony and evidence presented at trial, Melina reportedly blew marijuana smoke in Lyryk's face, claiming it would calm her down. But the real reason investigators believe was that he was worried she might test positive for drugs at a hospital, which would immediately trigger a Child Protective Services investigation. He blocked Amanda's initial attempts to seek care. He told her to wait. He told her it would be fine. It was not fine. By the morning of October 8th, Lyryk's condition was dire. She was unresponsive, limp, barely breathing. Amanda finally brought her to St. Luke's Magic Valley Medical Center in Twin Falls. Medical staff took one look at her and knew this was catastrophic. CT scans revealed a massive brain bleed and severe swelling. X-rays showed injuries in different stages of healing. Broken bones, internal trauma, bruises layered on top of older bruises. This was not a one-time incident. This was prolonged, repeated abuse. Lyryk was immediately airlifted to St. Luke's Children's Hospital in Boise, where pediatric trauma surgeons performed emergency surgery, removing part of her skull to relieve the pressure on her swelling brain. Her biological father, Logan, raced to Boise and stayed by her side as doctors worked desperately to save her. But the damage was too severe. Despite intensive care, despite everything the medical team tried, Lyryk Jean Altom died on October 14, 2017. She was 20 months old. Investigators from the Twin Falls Police Department and the Idaho Attorney General's office built the case methodically. They concluded that Joshua Melina had inflicted the majority of the physical abuse, including the fatal head injury that caused the brain bleed. But they also concluded that Amanda Dunlap had failed to protect her daughter. She had lied repeatedly to friends, family, and eventually to investigators. She had delayed medical care, and at critical moments she had prioritized staying with Melina over getting immediate help for Lyryk. Both were charged. Melina faced first-degree murder and multiple counts of felony injury to a child. Amanda was charged with first-degree murder, 8 counts of felony injury to a child, and 1 count of misdemeanor injury to a child. Melina's first trial, held in 2020, ended in a hung jury on the murder charge, though he was convicted on several child injury charges. Prosecutors retried him in 2022. This time, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no realistic chance of release. The judge emphasized the deliberate, sustained nature of the abuse and Melina's complete disregard for Lyryk's suffering. Amanda Dunlap's case took a different path. In 2023, she accepted a plea deal to lesser felony charges, avoiding a murder conviction. She was sentenced to up to 10 years indeterminate, with significant credit for time already served, approximately 5.5 years. Under the terms of her sentence, she could be eligible for parole in the mid to late 2020s, depending on her behavior in custody and the parole board's assessment. The disparity in their sentences sparked debate. Some argued that Amanda was also a victim trapped in an abusive relationship, afraid to leave. Others pointed to the text messages, the delays in seeking care, and the lies she told and said she had choices. And she chose wrong, again and again at Lyryk's expense. Logan, Lyryk's biological father, testified at both trials. He described sitting beside his daughter in the Boise ICU, watching as doctors removed part of her skull in a last-ditch effort to save her life. He talked about how unrecognizable she was from the happy, bright-eyed baby he had known just months earlier. He spoke about the guilt he carried, wondering if there was something he could have done, some sign he missed, some way he could have intervened before it was too late. Vigils were held in Twin Falls and Jerome. People who had never met Lyryk came together to mourn her, to light candles, to say her name. Online memorials keep her memory alive. Advocates have used her story to press for stronger mandatory reporting laws, quicker intervention when patterns of injury appear in young children, and better training for medical and social service professionals to recognize the signs of abuse before it's too late. Amanda and Melina's case sits at the intersection of intimate partner loyalty versus child safety, the legal and moral line between the hands-on abuser and the parent who stays, lies, and enables. And it brings us to the final case on our list. So what connects these 8 cases? What thread runs through the story of a woman who burned her family for insurance money in 1992? And a doomsday cult mother who buried her children in a pet cemetery in 2020, and a young woman who strangled her newborn in a bathroom during a pandemic? On the surface, they seem wildly different. Robin Rowe was driven by financial desperation, gambling debts, bad checks, and a $250,000 payout waiting on the other side of a locked door and a lit match. Veronica Herrera, too, seemed motivated by a desire to erase a problem, to make a child disappear rather than face the consequences of what she had done. Vallow was consumed by apocalyptic ideology, a twisted belief system that gave her permission to see her own children as obstacles to salvation. Emrik, Osuna, and Lyryk Altom suffered behind closed doors, victims of prolonged systematic abuse enabled by isolation and the failure of adults to intervene. Danielle Radue's crime happened in a moment. A flash of frustration, a violent shake, a baby who would never wake up. Melissa Jenkins staged an elaborate public search, weaponizing her community's compassion while knowing exactly where her son's body was. Elizabeth Keys hid a pregnancy and killed a newborn in a bathroom, driven by denial, panic, or something she claimed not to fully remember. These aren't one-size-fits-all monsters, but they share something, a choice, to prioritize themselves over the most vulnerable lives in their care. Idaho's justice system has responded to these crimes with some of the harshest sentences in the nation. Robin Rowe remains the only woman on Idaho's death row, more than 3 decades after she set that fire in Boise. Chad Daybell has been sentenced to death for his role in the murders of JJ, Tylee, and Tammy. Vallow, Monique Osuna, and Joshua Molina are all serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. Others, like Veronica Herrera, Danielle Radue, and Melissa Jenkins, face decades-long fixed terms before they can even be considered for release. Judges in these cases have used language like betrayal of maternal instinct, sadistic, grotesque abuse of trust. The legal system has made clear that these crimes will not be tolerated, that the people who commit them will be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. But legal consequences can't undo what was done. They can't bring back a single one of these children. So let's say their names again, slowly, because they deserve to be remembered. Randy, Joshua, and Tabitha Rowe, J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan, Emrik Osuna, Nakita, Keta Bean Herrera, Robbie Manwill, the unnamed newborn in Rathdrum, Dawson McKinney, Lyryk, Gene Altom. They loved dinosaurs, Spider-Man, Minnie Mouse, music. They had favorite toys, favorite foods, favorite people. They deserved to grow up. They deserved to go to school, make friends, fall in love, have careers, have families of their own. They deserved better. If you know a teacher, a neighbor, a mandated reporter, share this video. Sometimes one phone call can save a life. In the years since these tragedies, communities across Idaho have come together to honor these children and to push for change. Vigils have been held. Memorials have been built. There's an annual 5K in Robbie Manwill's name, where families wear blue ribbons and run to remember a boy who loved riding his bike. People left dinosaur toys at makeshift shrines for Emrik. Online pages keep Lyryk's memory alive, and advocates use her story to press for stronger mandatory reporting laws and faster intervention when patterns of injury appear in young children. There have been legislative pushes for better child welfare oversight, enhanced training for teachers and social workers, and systems that make it harder for abusers to isolate their victims. The emphasis, again and again, is on the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong, even if you're not sure, even if you're afraid of being wrong, even if it's uncomfortable. Because in almost every one of these cases, someone saw something, someone heard something, and they didn't act in time. If you made it this far, thank you for bearing witness to these stories. I know they're not easy. But I believe we owe it to these kids to remember them, not just as victims, but as people who mattered. Subscribe if you haven't yet, like this video, share it, and leave a comment. Tell me which story affected you most, or just drop the name of one of these kids. Let's make sure they're never forgotten. These 8 women are now serving life sentences or awaiting execution in Idaho's prisons. Their crimes are a matter of public record. Their names forever linked to some of the darkest chapters in the state's history. But the children they killed, those names deserve to be spoken louder. This is Beneath the Silence. Until next time, stay safe and look out for each other.